spaghetti squash boats. Spaghetti squash is a fabulous pasta alternative. We also really had to cut out all additives in the foods that we were eating. So if you noticed, I cut off the ends of the spaghetti squash. I scooped out the seeds from the center. And then basically, spaghetti squash, you want to turn your oven on to 400 and have that heated up. You can use parchment paper. You can use aluminum foil on your baking sheet. You can use nothing. I find with nothing, then I have a lot of scrubbing after. So I happen to use parchment paper. And you're going to drizzle the outside. You want to make sure that you get the rim as well as the center. You don't want too much in the well, too much olive oil in the well of the center. So really focus on getting the outside and then just a little bit on the inside. And then salt and pepper to your taste. Or no salt if you are trying to steer clear of salt. This is such a flavorful dish, honestly. If you were to leave salt out, you probably wouldn't miss it. And then you put this in the oven. You start with an hour and then you want to check it. So I cook the spaghetti squash bowl side up. You may see, if you were to look up online, you may see suggestions to cook your spaghetti squash down like that, and that's fine. I just find that a lot of that heat and moisture starts to steam, and then it makes it very soft. And honestly, I love that al dente crunch from the spaghetti squash, and I love caramelized bits. So to say that it's up to you to know whether or not your spaghetti squash is done. So you've done an hour, because sometimes spaghetti squash are much larger and thicker. So you've done an hour and you go to put your fork smack down in the center and it does not go all the way through easily to the baking sheet, then it's not done. If you have to apply any pressure whatsoever for it to go through, then it's not done. Put another 15 to 20 minutes, depending on how big your spaghetti squash is. But that's basically it. Just make sure your fork goes all the way down to the center. So next, we're gonna move on to the red sauce part. We're gonna start, I think the recipe calls for 1 to 1 1/4 pounds of tomatoes, and it says quartered in the recipe. What I can tell you, and I'm very deliberately doing this today, you could use any kind of tomato. You can use yellow tomatoes. These are tiny little green poppers, you know. You can use beefsteak. You can just whatever, plum tomatoes. It doesn't matter. Grape or cherry tomatoes or any small tomato. You do want to make sure that at least you nick it. I just go ahead and cut them in half. Here's the other thing, the recipe calls for 1 red bell pepper. Well, if all you have is green, use green. If all you have is orange or yellow, use orange or yellow. And you will also notice in the recipe that it calls for a lot of olive oil, a full 1/4 cup. I do like a lot of olive oil. I do believe that that gives it a meatiness, but you don't have to use that much olive oil. If oil is what you need to keep off of your menu, then use as little as you're comfortable with. It's absolutely fine. It's not going to harm the dish at all. It will make the dish a little bit lighter, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. So we have olive oil. It calls for a 1/2 teaspoon of oregano. I love basil. It's sweet. Oh my word. I could eat, I love basil. But if you don't like basil, you can do this with parsley. About a teaspoon of basil. And I'm going to get another baking sheet. Yeah. So once your tomatoes are on the pan, you can spread them out just like that. And then through the magic of television, we're going to waddle over. And these have been roasting now or these roasted for about an hour and 15 minutes. And you can see they're black and caramelized. All of that is flavor. This is not burn. This is flavor, all of it. So what we're going to do to make the sauce, now that this is roasted up nicely, is we're going to put all of this into a food processor or your blender. On that sheet that we roasted with the tomatoes and the peppers, we tossed onto that roasting sheet a couple of cloves of garlic, and that will be in your recipe. And here's where we add a lot of fun. So spinach, so that's what we usually have. The recipe calls for 1.5 cups. So I probably have about that in there. I'm gonna add just a little bit more. We're going to add, it says in the recipe, 6 large leaves of basil. And the basil I got from the store is just a little droopy, but it's all good. I wanna make, tell you about something in terms of these herbs. When you get basil, cilantro, parsley, or some of the other herbs that have these soft stems, there is a ton of flavor in this stem. And then for flavor, we came up with just a little touch of balsamic vinegar. If you only have apple cider, so I believe it calls in the recipe, it calls for about a teaspoon, and it's just a splash. And we're going to move on to the pesto. So again, I decided to use these inexpensive pumpkin seeds and 3 cups of your fresh basil and this nutritional yeast. So it's about 3/4 of a cup of nutritional yeast. I'm going to use a little bit less. The powder from the nutritional yeast is coming up. The last time I used 3/4 of a cup, I had to add a little bit of water. And that's just this nutritional yeast is somehow drier. And we can measure our oil. It's calling for 3/4 of a cup. So here we are, we have our spaghetti squash. We want to make sure you can see it. All right, so you want to add mostly your spaghetti or your red sauce, or in this case, it's more green, to the base of your spaghetti squash. You want it a little higher on one side than on the other side. You don't need a whole lot of pesto. And then you only need a little bit of your pesto on the other side. And then I'm going to go ahead and use am I allowed to use Parmesan cheese? When your kids can dive into it, they can take their fork and you start to sort of separate all of the pasta part from the outside, like so. And then literally, there it is. There's your spaghetti squash boats.